Hello, welcome to the second lecture of the Fiat Standard. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the start of the Fiat Standard as a monetary system and how it was born. To discuss that, of course, we need to go back to the history of England around the start of the First World War. England, before the First World War, was the global financial center. The Bank of England was the most important bank in the world. The majority of the world's population dealt with the Bank of England and used the British pound as their reserve currency. The Bank of England settled the majority of the world's trade, and because of that, it had a very prominent position in the world economy, and also it allowed it to have more British pounds outstanding than it had gold reserves backing it. So when the World War I started, the Bank of England found itself in a curious position. It didn't quite have enough gold to cover its position, but it also wanted to finance war. So this became a problem around July 1914, when war was beginning to break out in Europe. Depositors in England were trying to withdraw their gold from the Bank of England and to deposit their papers. But the Bank of England didn't have enough paper to deposit to fulfill the depositors' promises, because the Bank of England had grown accustomed to printing more British pounds than it had on hand. So in July 1914, the bank paid out £12.3 million in gold coins from its £26.5 million in total reserves. Almost half of all the reserves of the Bank of England in gold were paid out. And this was a bit of a problem. Foreign central banks also wanted to get some of their gold out, and the Bank of England faced the unthinkable prospect of a gold run, a bank run on its gold. So in November 1914, and at the same time, of course, they wanted to finance a war. So in November 1914, the British Treasury issued a war bond to finance the war, worth £350 million. And the idea was that the British public would buy the bond, and that money would be used to finance the war effort, and then the British government would pay back the bond and pay back the investors after the war was won. But, surprisingly, less than a third of these bonds were purchased. And this was a major problem for the English, because how could they finance the war effort? And how could they engage in the military adventures of World War I without all of this money? So what did the British do? Well, the Bank of England engaged in what our old friend John Maynard Keynes called a masterly manipulation. In November 1914, the Bank of England had two of its employees buy the 2/3 of the bonds that weren't bought up by the public. The money, of course, was not their own private money. It was money from the Bank of England. So the Bank of England basically bought the Treasury's bonds, financed the war effort, but of course they did not announce that. They engaged in what Keynes called a masterly manipulation. Of course, the Financial Times, which is always the mouthpiece of the Bank of England and central banks, and continues to this day to be that mouthpiece, published a story announcing that the war bonds were oversubscribed and that everybody wanted to get a piece of the action of financing the war in Europe. And this was viewed as settled history until very recently. Only in 2017 did this come to light. Only then did people find out that, after they were digging into the bank's archives in 2017, so more than 100 years after this war started, did the world find out that actually the British people did not buy the bonds to finance World War I. The war was financed through the Bank of England's masterly manipulation. This was really how the Fiat Standard was born. So now the Bank of England was massively short gold. It had effectively printed a whole bunch of money to finance the war bonds, and it had a lot of outstanding paper money, but not enough gold to back it. So what did they do? Well, they started collecting the golds from the banks and the post offices. They told banks and post offices to take payment from citizens in gold and to make payment in paper. And they encouraged the citizens to turn in all of their gold, and they made it nationalist duty for everybody. They emotionally blackmailed people's sense of nationalism in order to get them to hand over their gold to their local post office and bank. And then they got the post offices and the bank to hand over their gold to the central bank. We have the details of how this went about in the book, and I urge you, of course, to look at the book in detail to see how it was carried out. But to conclude, the cost of collecting the gold was roughly 0.01 of the face value of the gold. So for every pound of gold that the Bank of England collected cost the Bank of England somewhere in the range of 1 cent, 1 pence, 1% of the pound, basically. So they were able to move the country onto a paper money standard because they were able to collect the gold, and they stopped redeeming their obligations in gold. So to summarize, by using the war to suspend redeemability abroad and discourage it at home, the bank had successfully used its fiat, regulations, and monopoly control over the most important financial infrastructure in the world to finance the war effort without officially coming off the gold standard, announcing a suspension of gold redemption, or devaluing the pound. They used the war as an excuse. They told the world that we're not going to give you your gold because it's too dangerous to ship our gold right now because there's a war. And they used all kinds of regulation and manipulation in order to stop British people from holding gold, and in order to take in the gold and to give the people the paper. And as a result, they were able to finance the war effort without officially coming off the gold standard, or announcing a suspension of gold redemption, or officially devaluing the pound. This is why I like to call this the new alchemy. Thus was born a new science of government-sponsored financial alchemy. By controlling banks and confiscating gold, central banks could create money by fiat. By making the pound as good as gold, the new paper alchemists succeeded where Newton and the old alchemists failed. Gold could be produced at will, after all. The printing press and the checking account were the alchemists' long-sought philosopher's stone. So, for centuries and millennia, alchemists had thought of ways of how to make gold out of base metals. The Bank of England had effectively succeeded at it. They convinced people that they had gold in their hand, that they had a paper that was as good as gold, and yet they could print that paper at will, and they could issue credit that was as good as gold and issue it at will. This was effectively modern alchemy, and it seemed to work, at least during the war, initially. But of course, the honeymoon didn't last. Inflation hit. As we see in Figure 1 in the book, the war had a very, very significant impact on the value of the British pound. The prices were rising, and people didn't quite understand because inflation wasn't a very common thing at that point. They hadn't had a century of experience with inflation like we do today. And so, strangely, people just started noticing that prices began to rise. And so, according to the price index that the British government published in the UK Parliament papers in 1999, which you can see the source in the chapter, in chapter 2, in 1915, prices went up by 12.5%, and then the next year was 18.1%, and then 25.2%, and then 22%, and then 10.1%. So cumulative rise over the 5-year period was 124%. So prices more than doubled over the 5-year period of the war, which was a very, very high rise. And, people thought they were just getting into war, and maybe the war was causing it. They didn't quite understand the monetary manipulation that was taking place. But this chart makes it very clear how the price of the goods that people were buying was going up extremely quickly at a time. If you look historically before that, prices were very constant, and they were largely declining slightly every year. But then after the Bank of England started engaging in this inflation, prices started to go up very quickly. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations.
Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters, and Mexican billionaires Ricardo Salinas Pliego's new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight Computer. I love to work early in the morning and late at night, or in the sun outdoors, but regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they strain your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen on a simple computer I could use to write. I tried several models, but none were very good. Now, finally, Daylight have delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I've been using the Daylight Computer to write my next book, and it is absolutely fantastic, and it has led me to invest in this company myself. Check out my interview with Anjan Kata in episode 249.
So now, this is where we understand how fiat was born. Initially, it starts off with the central bank buying bonds to finance war or to finance whatever kind of emotionally important undertaking the government wants to undertake. And then it takes over the gold from the society. It gives them paper and credit instead. It issues a lot of paper, issues a lot of credit. And then once it's faced with the price rise, there are 2 options of what to do. The prudent step, the honest thing to do, would have been to acknowledge that the fiat standard had served its purpose as a temporary war financing measure and to return to the gold standard. Governments had repeatedly promised this, and Europe's citizens had expected it. However, returning to the gold standard at the pre-war parity would have meant an inevitable end to the inflationary boom started by the credit expansion that financed the war and subsequently a painful recession. So, while this would have been the honest thing to do, it was obviously a very politically unpopular thing to do because it would have caused a recession, and no government wants to preside over a recession. But so most European countries didn't choose this. The US, though, did choose this path because the US was in a unique position in which it stayed on the gold standard until 1917. So whereas Britain and most of European countries went off the gold standard in 1914, the US stayed on the gold standard until 1917. And during that 3-year period, there was an enormous amount of gold that entered the US from Europe, that migrated from Europe to the US. And so the US's monetary strength was enhanced significantly by the war. And so it was possible for the US to go back on the gold standard. It wasn't that difficult for them because they had a lot of gold. And there was a recession in the US, but it was a quick and sharp recession in 1920, after which the US economy began one of its longest expansions in history. US gold redemption resumed in 1922 after a 5-year suspension. So by 1922, you could go back, and the dollar was again backed with gold, and you could redeem your dollars for gold. But Britain, on the other hand, tried to square the impossible circle of maintaining the Treasury's high spending, the Union's high wage requirements, the gold peg at its pre-war rate, and sterling's role as a global reserve currency. So Britain faced the problem of the deeply politically unpopular problem of how do we get back on a gold standard with all of this extra money out there. They could have devalued the currency, but that would have been very unpopular. They could have forced unions to accept lower wages, but that would have been very unpopular for unions. And they wanted to also maintain the sterling as a global reserve currency. That was practically an impossible thing to pull off for Britain after World War I. And Rothbard gives us a very good explanation of what happened. Rothbard in America's Great Depression, which is a very important book that I highly recommend reading. He says essentially, in short, Britain insisted on returning to gold at a valuation that was 10 to 20% higher than the going exchange rate, which reflected the results of war and post-war inflation. So they wanted to just effectively ignore the effects of the war and ignore the inflation and assume that they could just go back to the original parity. But this meant that British prices would have had to decline by about 10 to 20% in order to remain competitive with foreign countries and to maintain her all-important export business. But no such decline occurred, primarily because unions did not permit wage rates to be lowered. Real wage rates rose, and chronic large-scale unemployment struck Great Britain. And we see this repeat over and over again. This chapter is extremely informative because this was really the first time we see this example in a modern capitalist industrial economy, but we've seen it repeat all over the 20th century, all over the world. After the inflation comes the unemployment and the recession, and the deeply politically unpopular demand, the deeply politically unpopular need for admitting the inflation, which politically is very unpopular, and therefore governments choose to delay the reckoning and choose to delay the inevitable. And so, as Rothbard continues, credit was not allowed to contract, as was needed to bring about deflation, as unemployment would have grown even more menacing. And unemployment caused partly by the post-war establishment of government unemployment insurance, which permitted trade unions to hold out against any wage cuts. So they could not stop credit expansion. They had to continue to spend and print money and generate credit, because that would allow unions and strong politically connected influence in Britain to continue to basically live the economic delusion that they were still in the pre-war period and that the inflation had not happened and that prices and wages don't need to adjust. So, as a result of this, Great Britain tended to lose gold. Instead of repealing unemployment insurance, contracting credit, and or going back to gold at a more realistic parity, Great Britain inflated her money supply to offset the loss of gold and turned to the United States for help. For if the United States government were to inflate American money, Great Britain would no longer lose gold to the United States. In short, the American public was nominated to suffer the burdens of inflation and subsequent collapse in order to maintain the British government and the British trade union movement in the style to which they insisted on becoming accustomed. I think this is an enormously important period in history, extremely pivotal in 20th century history, and like many and maybe most important politically pivotal moments in history, it's of course not discussed much because the truth is kind of very ugly. So Britain had the problem of needing to go back to its currency at its old valuation because they didn't want to admit the masterly manipulation that they had engaged in. But the problem was, if they continued to print money at the old rate, that meant that gold was undervalued in Britain. In other words, if you were a British person, or any person from anywhere in the world, and you had British pounds, you could buy gold at a low price in Britain, and then you could send it to the US or France or any other country and exchange it for dollars or francs at a much higher rate. So there was a very profitable arbitrage opportunity there. Britain, by trying to go back to the pre-war parity, the rate that was prevalent before the war, Britain was basically putting its gold on discount. It was telling the world, you can get our gold for £4.25, when in reality, given the prevalent exchange rates, that meant the gold was at a low, that meant the gold was undervalued. So you could take your British pounds, buy gold in Britain, ship the gold to the US, sell the gold in the US, get dollars from the US, send the dollars back to Britain, and you'll make more British pounds that way. So the result was gold would flow out of Britain to the US and to other countries where the value of gold was more in line with the market fundamentals of the national currency. And this is what we see happening across the fiat standard today with capital flights. When governments insist on fixing the price of their reserve currencies according to their currency, that just means that people will speculate against that currency, sell the national currency, buy the reserve currency in that country, and then send the reserve currency abroad. And the way to stop that today, of course, is through capital controls, which we'll discuss in more detail in Lecture 6. But back then, what the British sought to do was they figured out that if they could get the American government to engage in inflation, then the American dollar would also be devalued. And then if the American dollar is devalued compared to gold, then we'd get into some form of equilibrium between the two, where it stops being profitable for speculators to take gold from Britain and sell it in the US. In other words, rather than stop inflation in Britain, Britain pressured the US to engage in inflation, and therefore, if the two of them are inflationary, then we would go back to a new kind of equilibrium where gold doesn't flow away from the UK. So again, another short-term fix, and this is exactly what we see over and over again with the Fiat Standard, a short-term fix that creates more and more problems in the long term. So this again sounds like it solved the problem. Well, now we don't have a problem with fiat, with gold leaving Britain, but where did the problem go? You can't cheat economic reality. You can't lie to economic reality. So where did all that problem go? That problem manifested in inflation in the United States. And so as a result, the inflation moved to the US, and that was to eventually cause the Great Depression. So another way of trying to solve this problem was that the US and the UK attempted to introduce a gold exchange standard modeled on the monetary arrangements that had prevailed in some Asian countries before the war, the abuse of which caused the Bank of England to have a gold shortage at the eve of the war. In essence, global central banks would deposit gold at the Bank of England and US Federal Reserve and use their international settlement network to add salability across space to their gold. This gave the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve significant leeway to go off the gold standard because other countries' reliance on these institutions' financial infrastructure for international trade settlement meant they would rarely attempt to take physical custody of the gold. So this is really how the problems had started in the first place. Because the British colonies could only trade with one another by using the Bank of England as their network for settlement, that meant that they had to keep a lot of gold in the Bank of England. And that meant that they couldn't just call on this gold, because if they were to withdraw all of that gold from the Bank of England, they would end up with lots of gold in their own home country, but they'd had no way of using it to settle trade. Well, I mean, they did have a way of using it to settle trade, but would have been expensive, extremely expensive, to put it on boats and use it, to settle trade periodically with other countries. So, think about India and South Africa and Brazil having to trade with one another. Before World War I, it would have been extremely expensive to ship gold physically every time those countries wanted to trade with one another. But by using the Bank of England, they could save enormously on the cost of gold clearance. In other words, the Bank of England added salability across space to the gold. And this concept of salability across space is a key concept in this book. It's really the fundamental premise, the fundamental analytical tool that we use to analyze fiat money in this book. And we're going to come back to it repeatedly across the chapters of this book. So, because gold is very expensive to move around, colonies needed to use the Bank of England before the World War I in order to trade with the rest of the world. And that meant that they had to leave a lot of their gold at the Bank of England, and that meant that the Bank of England could issue more pounds, more credit than it had, than the gold it had, because it knew that all of these countries can't come and withdraw and ask to withdraw all of their gold. Effectively, by keeping their gold in the Bank of England, the Bank of England could just print money. And so, after World War I, and as the inflation was a problem in the US and the UK, they copied that model, the model that Britain had used with its colonies, and tried to implement it again in new international monetary arrangements. And that's what they did. And so they introduced something called the Gold Exchange Standard, where countries across the world would deposit their gold at the US Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, and that would just then allow them to print more money to save their currencies. It effectively increased demand for their currency. And then that inflation of the 1920s, caused by the gold exchange standard and caused by Britain pressuring the US to print more money, that would cause the massive boom of the 1920s, and that would then result in the 1929 stock market crash and then the Great Depression of the 1930s. And then in 1933, the US followed Britain's lead. In 1933, the US did what Britain did in 1915, which is confiscate the gold. It was more blatant in the case of the US because the situation was more desperate at that time. And so the US, President Roosevelt issued the Executive Order 6102, in which they just seized all of the gold that existed in the banks and gave people dollars in exchange of it, and they devalued the dollar. It used to be that gold was worth $20 an ounce, and then they devalued it to 35. So there was about a 40% devaluation of the dollar. And as a result of this, of course, the government of the US grew enormously, and there was a massive growth in the bureaucracy, in the military-industrial complex, and of course in inflation. And this would then lead to World War II, and I think this was enormously consequential because it was this inflation that took place across the world in the 1920s and 30s that led to the growth of very powerful governments across the world, led to the growth of totalitarian regimes across the world, and led to the rise of these militant regimes that could only fight one another because they were all blaming each other for all of the world's economic problems, and they were all imposing trade restrictions which restricted trade and prevented goods from flowing and destroyed the global world order that had emerged under the gold standard and replaced it with a fractured global monetary and economic order built on animosity, where governments and regimes blamed each other for things. And of course, they blamed their local populations and they blamed their local ethnic minorities. And that led to World War II. And after World War II, it led to even, the move of the global monetary system from being based around the British pound and the dollar to being predominantly based around the US dollar. So what started in 1914 was really the devaluation of the British pound and the loss of value and the loss of significant monetary role for the British pound in favor of the US dollar. And that continued throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And then the US dollar, of course, was also engaged in more and more inflation, but it was because the US was the leading power of the world at that time. They exported their dollars to the rest of the world. And under the Bretton Woods system, more and more of the world's countries had held dollars as reserves. But the idea was that the dollar was redeemable for gold, for global central banks at least. So Americans couldn't own gold, and they couldn't redeem their dollars for gold after the 1933 confiscation, but foreign central banks could. That was the idea in principle. But of course, as global central banks started to demand to take custody of their gold instead of the dollar reserves that they had, the U.S. had expanded its money supply significantly, and it could not meet all of those demands. And so, as a result, in 1971, they depegged the dollar from gold. So, in conclusion, this was really what I call the Fiat Standard protocol installation. The whole world copied this process. First, you run unsustainable deficits. You default by confiscating and restricting the movement of gold. And this is a very important point. The confiscation of gold is default. It's not called default, but it is default because the government had promised that they would redeem your papers for gold, but then they just go ahead and tell you, no, you can't redeem your paper for gold. Here's more paper. So that's a default, really. And of course, you restrict the movement of gold. You stop banks from using gold, and you stop international trade being based on gold. You suspend the redemption of gold. You increase the supply of paper notes. And if you can, you try to get other countries to hold your currency as a reserve. This is a very important part of it because this prevents your currency from devaluing a lot. And of course, the US did it best in the post-World War II system, in the Bretton Woods system. So, in summation, if we wanted to think about how Fiat Standard came into being, the Bank of England effectively went off the gold standard in 1914 and only returned in 1925 on a gold bullion standard, which it abandoned in 1931. The US abandoned the gold standard in 1917, but restored it in 1922 and abandoned it again in 1934. Britain and the US adopted a gold exchange standard in 1922 and abandoned it in 1971 to go on a fiat dollar standard. Since 1914, both currencies have lost more than 95% of their value relative to gold. The fiat standard installation process has been a long one, but it has had these hallmarks: gold confiscation, price increases, price controls, central planning, inflationary credit expansion, booms and busts, and the aspiration to export inflation by trying to dump fractionally backed currency on foreign regimes.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
So, in conclusion, we see that the fiat standard, I think this is an enormously important point, and it's something that fiat enthusiasts and defenders don't get. The fiat standard was not the design of an engineer. It was instead the central bank's desperate solution to their looming insolvency, the inevitable geopolitical outcome of a 60-year-long marriage of politics and money. The history of fiat is the history of government-run financial institutions managing default. It was not a technology consciously designed to provide sound money or payment transfers. Central banks the world over would closely follow the prototype set by Britain and the US, as they too would default on gold and force the use of their fiat. The process of implementing this standard, which started in 1914, had been practically completed by 1971. A century after its genesis and a half-century after it took on its final operational form, it is now possible to pass judgment on this monetary standard. And that is what we attempt to do in this book. The point of this chapter, the second chapter in the book, is to really arrive at just explaining the conclusion that this was not a conscious design and that this was a product of a government default. If you read economics textbooks, Keynesian economics textbooks, this is presented, the fiat standard, the ability of government to control money, the idea of having the entire monetary system in the hand of the government. It's presented as if it is a remarkable engineering achievement, that, some geniuses, Keynes and a bunch of others around the early 20th century figured out that gold was extremely inefficient because it's extremely expensive and you can't print it. And now if we just have the government print money, then this would be a much better idea. And that's a bald-faced lie. It's nonsense. The fiat standard was never introduced as an honest solution. It was never put to a vote. It was never discussed in Parliament. It was never honestly introduced. It was a lie. It was a cover-up. It was a cover-up for default. We had institutions that were insolvent, and they covered up their insolvency by turning government debt into money and by using and dealing with government debt as if it is money. So this is not a history book, and we're not going to spend the rest of this book talking about the historical circumstances that led to this development and how it happened. The point of this book is to really study how fiat works. And the point of this chapter, as I said, is to just illustrate that it was not the conscious design of an engineer. It was the political solution to a problem of default. And we're going to see how this shaped the design of this monetary system in the coming chapters and lectures.